put you as a co-host.
On Zoom, you press OK.
Thanks, Sandra. I'm glad you heard
Alan,
that.
you are the co-host, so
Yeah,
if
well,
you
I
want
know
to
I've done
share.
a lot of Zoom things, but I figured today I'd do the dial-up.
Okay.
That's Sandra.
Okay, am I good to go? Awesome.
Yeah, is this Anna?
Yes, this is Anna.
Hi. Oh, hi, it's Christine. Nice to reconnect. I know you've been Critters Corner with us, and welcome. We figured out how to do Zoom and the telephone conferencing together, so you'll probably know some of the participants on this call.
That's wonderful. Are there participants who are on Zoom at the moment, or has everyone dialed in?
I'm not too sure. Mildred, is there anybody via Zoom?
It doesn't look like it. That's no problem. So I do have a slideshow with some images. So I'll describe what I'm sharing. But then, as Mildred mentioned, they'll also this is being recorded, so you can always go back and take a look at the pictures that I'm talking about.
Okay, perfect.
Great. So I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, bear with me. First of all, thank you so much for having me again. I'm thrilled to be back here and presenting. So this is very exciting. My name is Anna Patterson, and I'm the Education Events and Volunteer Coordinator here at Dundas Museum and Archives. And we're located right in Dundas, Ontario, part of Hamilton. We're a little neighborhood to the west of Hamilton. I had to think about that for a second there. And so we are actually in between exhibits at the moment. I am just going to start my slideshow from the beginning. Perfect. Wonderful. So hopefully anyone who wants to can come back and take a look at the images. So yes, we're actually between exhibits at the moment. So what I'm going to be speaking about today is our exhibit that we just wrapped up, which was called Leading Ladies, Early Dundas Women's Groups. Now, I can't talk about our present exhibit because it's not up yet. It will be going up May 28th, and it will be called Dundas 175, What Dundas Means to Me. And we're recognizing the 175th anniversary of the incorporation of the town of Dundas. And we're taking lots of submissions from community organizations and members and businesses. So I do invite everyone listening in today to get in contact with the museum if there's something you'd like to contribute. But I'm going to rewind for a moment and act as if this is anywhere between February 8th and May 7th, which was this exhibit. And this exhibit was really exciting. I absolutely loved it because it was a really deep dive into women's organizations in Dundas, and especially with Dundas and Hamilton. They're very industrial towns, very industrial cities. And so you do tend to hear a little bit more about the factories and the industry and the men, and that is a theme throughout a lot of history. But what's nice is that this was a look at the women who made impacts on the community in mostly the 1900s. A little bit of the 1800s there, right at the beginning there. So it all started because of the anniversary of the Dundas Travel Club, which is this year, and they've celebrated 125 years of active operation here in Dundas. And so that kind of launched the idea for this exhibit. So when we were taking a look at researching some of the early women's groups in Dundas, we really noticed a common trend, and it seems to be quite broadly applied across Canada, which is that you have the, sorry, I'm just going to turn the volume down on the office phone here. That was distracting to me. So I hope it wasn't distracting to anyone else. We noticed this trend, and the trend is that a lot of women's organizations, specifically women's organizations, started in 1897 or around 1897. And we believe that that's because of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. So that was a really big event. It occurred in 1897, and it marked her 60th year on the throne. And so that ended up sort of really invigorating this sense of women's ability to be leaders, to be significant active members of the community, to take a more active interest in things like politics and the world and everything. Not that they weren't before, but this was a big she was a figurehead, and so she was living proof that that women were more than capable of being involved in all of these things. And so we do have this this big shift in the late 1800s of these women's organizations starting. So here in Dundas, as I mentioned, the big impetus for the exhibit itself was the Dundas Travel Club. And so what I have here is on the screen, for those of you who aren't who can't see it at the moment, is a photograph of a group of women in sort of very early 1900s clothing, and they are gathered in a park, and there is, I would say over or around 20 women in the photograph, and these are members of the travel club. So the travel club here in Dundas was formed not, as the name might suggest, to travel, but more to learn about travel. So things like newspapers were more accessible. You have information traveling the world much more quickly with phones and telegrams and everything. And so there's this interest in connecting with the world and connecting with nations around the world. And so these women, and they did tend to be women who were part of the middle to upper class here in Dundas. These were, wives and daughters of the wealthy businessmen and people who, had businesses and shops and stuff. So this wouldn't have been necessarily available to women who had to work to support their family. But these women wanted to have an opportunity to get together and actually discuss countries around the world. And so they would do research, they would do presentations for each other, and they would talk about these different countries, different areas, different regions. They would sometimes have people who had experience in those places talking about them. And so it was a way for these women to sort of broaden their minds, to do some research, especially university wasn't always an option at this point. It was starting to become an option, but wasn't always available. And so this was a way for women in the town of Dundas to get together, to socialize, and to sort of do some continuing education. And so this organization, as I mentioned, was formed in 1897 and continues to this day. So I also am now sharing on my screen a photograph from June of 1997 from the 100th anniversary of the Travel Club. And so hopefully you're able to pop onto YouTube later and take a look, because the difference in the images is really interesting. You have now that it's a color image, they're on a porch, they have 1990s clothing on, but there's also a lot of similarities. It's this large group of women who have come together. They're happy and smiling, and they are excited to be there at this gathering. And so I like some of the change and the continuity of this. And so this the Travel Club continues to this day. There are active members. They meet regularly. They continue doing their research and their presentations, their writing. And I imagine it's probably a little bit easier to do the research now with the introduction of the internet. But it's really exciting to still have this organization in town that has such a long history. So the next organization I will mention is the Women's Art Association of Hamilton. And this was an organization that was made up of women artists. And this was especially big in Dundas because we have this incredible tradition of artists here. And it, sorry, I'm just gonna try to play with my settings for a quick second. Let's see if I can do this. I'm going to try to, I don't know if that worked. So I am going to just start that again, no worries. From current slide, perfect. Yeah, so there is this really long history of Dundas being an artist's community rather. We have, of course, DVSA, we have the Carnegie Gallery, and all of these were very heavily influenced by women. And one such woman who was very highly involved in a lot of these organizations was the artist Hortense Gordon. And so she worked in the early 1900s. Her style is absolutely beautiful. It's very Art Nouveau with these beautiful sort of natural lines. And then again, for those of you who aren't able to view the screen, I have a picture of what looks like a tall teapot. It's actually a chocolate pot. So it is for serving hot chocolate, but it is hand painted by Hortense Gordon. She did a lot of ceramics, she did a lot of painting. And so she did a lot of ceramic painting. And we have this beautiful chocolate serving set here at the museum in our collection that she hand painted around circa 1926. And so it's a collection, it's almost a lilac color opalescent base of the design, and then it's sort of gold leaf painted on top, and it's absolutely beautiful. And so we have this wonderful set from Hortense, and she was involved not only with the Women's Art Association of Hamilton, but with the Carnegie and DVSA and all of these organizations that still exist today. So why are we not advancing? There we go. The next organization that I'm going to talk about is the Shakespeare Society. And the Shakespeare Society was another organization that was formed in the late 1800s. This one actually was formed in 1894, so a few years before the Jubilee. But it was another opportunity for women to gather, to socialize, to do continuing education, to read, and really to be together. And so the society was not necessarily for analyzing plays or anything like that, but it was sort of to read together, to appreciate them. And it is no longer running. This is the first one that isn't running anymore, unfortunately. But it ran up until it was within the 2000s that it closed. I don't think I'm remembering the exact date at the moment, but it did operate right into this century. So the images on my screen that I'm sharing here, on the left, I have a picture from the very early beginning of the Dundas Shakespeare Society, Women's Shakespeare Society. It's a group of 4 women. They are dressed in very classically Victorian garb. So this is likely from within the first 6 years of the organization starting. I think it's probably the first or second year, but it's hard to date the photo exactly. But there's 4 women. They have hats on. They look like they're having a bit of a good time. There's some little smirks on some of their faces. And so this is actually a postcard. The image is taken from a postcard, but it was 4 women who had gathered to be part of the Shakespeare Society. Then the image that I have on the right of my screen is a picture of a living room. And this is from, I believe, the 1990s. And this shows a group of women. There are, I believe, 7 or 8 in the picture. There's also a dog in the picture, so you know that the dog enjoyed Shakespeare as well. And they have their tea, and they are set up around the living room, continuing to read the plays. And again, this is another really lovely juxtaposition of the old and the new, and just showing how long these societies continued. And so this was another influential organization here in Dundas. One thing that I'll mention before I continue with the next group is that one of the challenges with researching these organizations, and specifically the individual women within the organizations, was that a lot of the records at the time would record simply Mrs. So-and-so. And so that became a bit of a challenge, because then even if they had even if there was a first name, it was often their husband's first name. And so we only had the husband's name. And so it would take a little bit of digging through through the archives, through some records online, to try to figure out what the first names of the women were, and even what their maiden names were, what their family name was before they got married. So it was an added challenge. And it is interesting actually to see kind of the shift in records around sort of the turn of the century, where you start, the turn of the century, mid-century, where you do start to see more recordings of single women attending, unmarried women, shockingly. And then also married women recording with their own first names. And so it is interesting to see that shift over time. And these organizations, these ones have been a little bit more for pleasure, for social engagement, and continuing education for the women in the organization. But a lot of the other organizations were community service-based organizations. So we also have the Victorian Order of Nurses. And this was an organization that was active in Dundas. The image that I have that takes up the majority of the screen that I'm sharing at the moment is a picture of a group of Canadian nurses. There's 5 women here, and they are, the picture is actually overseas. It's in France at the Canadian General Hospital in the Second World War in the 1940s. And so these are women from Ontario who went overseas to serve during the Second World War as nurses. And so they are all wearing their military uniforms. And one of them is Teresa Woolsey, who is from Dundas. She's actually the first on the left, if you're looking at it left to right. So she has this big smile on her face. The women are sitting down and they're laughing. They've got smiles on. And we have, there's actually a second woman as well in the picture who's also from Dundas, Catherine Hull. And she is, I believe, the third from the left. What's really neat about this particular image is that we have in our collection Teresa Woolsey's uniform, and it's on display here at the museum, and it's part of actually our permanent exhibit. And so if you're able to come down and visit the museum, although Leading Ladies is no longer up, you can still see Teresa Woolsey's nursing uniform from the Second World War, and it's really it's really impactful to see the picture of her wearing it in the Dundas Star newspaper, and then also have the actual artifact on display. And so, of course, the Victorian Order of Nurses was an organization that was based predominantly on community care. And what was especially important about this organization in Dundas was that these were medically trained women who were able to make house calls. And especially in Dundas, which was a smaller town, and especially the surrounding area, Flamborough, Waterdown, further out to Binbrook and Glamborough and all those places, it could be more difficult to have a doctor come visit you or to go and see a doctor. And so this was a way that people were able to receive medical care in their home from these nurses. Another organization that we look at in this exhibit is the Women's Institute. And the Women's Institute is an organization that continues to this day. It was founded to be a way for rural women to have an opportunity to get together and to have talks and do lots of learning. It was founded by Adelaide Hoodless Hunter, who her homestead is in St. George, which is just about a 20-minute drive away from Dundas. And then the home where it was sort of founded is in Stony Creek. You can go and visit it at the Erland Lee Museum. And this organization was founded specifically to give women the opportunity to have additional information, to learn how to better take care of their families, their farms, their homes. And it was really inspired by, I believe, I might be getting this wrong, and I do apologize, but it was, I believe, the death of one of the children of the founding member, and so she learned later on some different techniques that could have possibly prevented the death. I believe it was from spoiled milk, I think is what it was. And so she thought this should never happen again. It was completely preventable. More women need to have access to this information. And so that was the founding of the WI. So Dundas did have its own WI. It no longer has a branch here in Dundas, but there are other branches operating in Ontario and around the world to this day. And so this is an image of the WI in the I believe this was in 1947 that this picture was taken. And the newspaper, I have a picture up on the screen, and it is a group of women in 1940s, 1950s clothing. They have hats on, and there's a large banner behind them that says "For Home and Country," and that's the motto of the WI. And then on the right, I have a newspaper clipping that talks about the 50th anniversary of the WI branch here in Dundas. The Coketown branch continued longer, and there are branches in the area that are still active. I believe the Stony Creek one is still active. So it's something that they're actively recruiting new members all the time. So if that interests you, you can find a local branch. Another organization that was here in town was the Iode. This was the International Order of the Daughters of the Empire, I believe, if I have that correct. And so they were women who were particularly interested in the sort of preservation of the British Empire. So especially around this time, there's lots of changes happening. Canada, of course, is its own country, but we have eventually Canada divest itself more fully from Britain. But around this time, we have this organization, and they had the reason sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting very excited about the picture that's on the screen, and I'll explain what it is. Yes, so the IODE was another organization that was focused on community work, volunteer work, giving back to the community. So on the screen at the moment, I have a newspaper clipping. This is from 1947, and it talks about an X-ray clinic opening in Dundas, and it mentions it's being operated under the direction of the Ontario Tuberculosis Association, and the local work was done by members of the Iode. And then it also says, and volunteers from women's institutes and other groups. And so you see this continuation of this community work by these women's organizations into the 1940s and beyond. Now, the picture that I have on the screen that hopefully you can take a look at in a bit is a young woman in 1947, and her name is at the time it was Jean Mitson. Today it's Jean Harvey, and she has, it's almost a Grecian kind of gown on with sort of a crossed banner on her chest, and she appeared as to represent the Yukon in this parade that was happening, the Iode Centennial Parade, or Iode Centennial Float. Rather, my apologies. But the reason that we particularly love this image is that Jean Harvey is one of our very beloved volunteers here at the museum. And so she's continued to live in Dundas. She has these incredible stories of the history of the town. And we have this phenomenal picture of her from 1947 on this float as sort of Miss Yukon. And so it's really delightful. And she has a really fun quotation here. It says, or she wrote, "I remember my mother was in the Iode, and during the war, she sent me down to one of the meetings where the ladies were knitting socks and scarves and such for the soldiers. I had learned how to knit from my grandmother, and she had taught me the German style of knitting that they do on the continent. And that's where the yarn is held in the left hand instead of the right. Well, the lady there smacked me on the right on the wrist and said, 'That's the German style. We're fighting the Germans.'" And so it's just kind of a really funny reminiscence from Jean about her participation in the Iode, and of course the kinds of things that they were doing, doing knitting to support soldiers, and other activities on the home front during the Second World War. The next picture that I have on my screen is another photograph of a group of women. They're all in long white gowns. There is only one man in the photograph, and he is actually the image of this man is the only image of a man that ended up in this entire exhibit. And this is an image of the Rebeccas. So the Rebeccas were an offshoot organization of the Oddfellows, and there's still an Oddfellows organization here in Dundas, or a branch here in Dundas. There is not currently a Rebecca's because there was only one Rebecca left, and so she joined the Oddfellows. They are more gender inclusive than they were in the 1900s, and so. But this photograph is from the 1920s, and it shows the group of women who were part of the Rebeccas. And the Rebeccas was another social organization that did, had community involvement and service in the community. And this would have been a picture at, sorry, I said 1920s. It could be a little bit later. I'm maybe thinking of the exhibit that's of the other image that we had up. Either way, it would be from one of their formal meetings. So likely sort of their yearly general meeting, which is why there is a man in the photograph. He would have been the head of the Oddfellows, the sort of umbrella organization that the Rebeccas would have fallen under. So in their day-to-day or regular meetings, there wouldn't have been any men present. It would have just been the women. And we're really fortunate because there's still the Oddfellows branch here in Dundas. They had an absolute treasure trove of artifacts related to the Rebeccas. And we were incredibly fortunate to do a community curator exhibit with the Oddfellows a couple years ago, pre-pandemic. And so we have a great relationship with them. And we reached out to them and said, do you have any information about the Rebeccas? We were really just looking for sort of some, dates, maybe some names of people involved. And they said, yeah, we actually have everything from the Rebeccas here in Dundas. They had pictures, they had an example of the ceremonial robe, they had a tiara that one of them wore on a parade float, they had their voting box, and banners as well that had some of the symbols from the Rebeccas on it, and this absolute treasure trove of artifacts. It was amazing. And so not only did they say, we'll loan them to you to be in this exhibit, this is really important, but they also said, you should have them, the Dundas Museum should have them. So they made a big donation to the museum of these artifacts. And so now we have these artifacts related to this women's organizations in our permanent collection here. So they're not on display, but they are part of our permanent collection now at the museum. I just wanted to take a moment here and double check how I'm doing for time. I'm not, oh, I see it. To do the Rebeccas. So the Rebeccas, they were another sort of social organization. So they would do community volunteering. They would raise money for organizations in the community, especially things like hospitals and supporting sick and elderly people. And they were, the name comes from the story of Rebecca in the Bible, and sort of this basis on service. And service in the community. And so that was sort of their main focus in the Rebeccas. And it was kind of the Oddfellows had already existed, and then some women were interested in joining, and they said, no, but you could form your own. And they did exactly that.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
No problem. Mildred, how much time do I have left?
A couple of minutes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm almost at the end there, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't going too far over or anything. Yes, so the Rebeccas, so we've talked about that. I believe there are possibly still some Rebecca's branches around. There isn't one in Dundas. It finished in the 2000s. Because as I mentioned, there was a late one woman left, and so she joined the Oddfellows. So I believe I'm on my last women's groups. And so this one is actually a girls organization. And this is the Girl Guides. So we had the Girl Guides here in Dundas. We had a troop here in Dundas very, very early. It was one of the early organization, or one of the early branches after the founding of the Girl Guides. So again, on my screen, I have 2 newspaper clippings. I have on the left, it's 2 photographs. One is a Girl Guide and a Scout, and one is 2 Girl Guides together. And this is from 1953, and it talks about they went to City Hall in Toronto. They spent the afternoon at the Royal Ontario Museum, and some of them received the Gold Cord Award. And so these were girls from Dundas who were given these awards across, people, other Girl Guides across Ontario. The other image I have is another newspaper clipping, my apologies, and it talks about the founding. So it says, Girl Guides, Captain Nan Haygarth conducted the well-attended meeting of the first Dundas Girl Guides on Monday evening. Each patrol put on a skit with company leader Jean Traver in charge. Plans were discussed for a mother and daughter banquet to be held in the near future. Games were played, and Captain Haygarth closed the meeting. So it's a little report of their meeting. And these reports would of social organizations, men's, women's, everybody's, would often appear in the newspapers, kind of letting the community and the town know what these organizations were doing. And so the Girl Guides were no different. They would have frequent mentions in the newspapers about the kinds of activities that they were doing in town. And what's kind of interesting about the Girl Guides is that they are sort of would be the second generation, the daughters of the generations of the women who started these organizations in Dundas. And so you have this sort of tradition, this history, this the passed down values of these organizations for women to be involved in their community, to do acts of service, volunteer, raise money, socialize, educate each other and themselves. And so it's this kind of ongoing tradition that continues to this day here in Dundas with these organizations continuing, new Girl Guide groups, and many others. And so even though the world is definitely very, very different than it was in 1897, a lot of these values of community service and sisterhood are still very much held in town. So that does bring me more or less to the end of my presentation. I will wrap up now. So again, as I mentioned, unfortunately, this exhibit is no longer up at the museum. We will be launching our new exhibit, Dundas 175. It will open on May 28th, so at the end of this month. But hopefully you're able to go back and take a look at the video of this presentation and take a look at some of the images that I talked about, because they're really wonderful images. And I should also mention that aside from the portrait of Queen Victoria on the very first slide, all of these are items that are in our permanent collection here at the museum. So these are all items from right here in Dundas. So thank you so much for having me today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Oh. It's okay. Let me stop the recording.